Okay, so now comes, well, probably one of the more intricate or complex parts of the build, I guess, because there's so many options of things that we could do. First of all, these super absorbers are awesome. Do not eat, but if you want to reuse them, you can definitely reuse them for stuff you want to keep humidity down. We are going to have to build our water cooler of sorts. Basically, we're going to have to put the fans on, figure out our mounting, right, because that's a whole nother thing, and then also get our radiator and our heat sink and pump mounted. Now if you'll notice, it has a removable cover. Please don't forget to take that off. We're going to have to take that off before we get on everything else, right? We're going to have to use thermal paste to do that kind of stuff. But as far as what's in the box, well, we're going to have to do a little bit of customization. Now I'm going to try this with a top mount configuration because I think that's going to work out better. But we do have to talk about some specifics as far as water cooling goes. Okay, so water cooling, it really is important on how you orient things. Basically, this is filled with water, right? But there is a little bit of an air gap in there. So you literally have to pay attention to gravity, right? And how things go every which way this way. So later on we'll talk about why we're doing what we're doing, but I'm probably going to try to top mount our water cooler in our PC. So stay tuned. So if you guys look at it, the instructions for the power supply are actually pretty clear in the sense that they're really giving you some pictures and they made it fairly simple for us to put this together. There's two sides, right? One for AMD and one for the Intel sockets. It used to be a lot more complex, right, until we could figure out what was going where, but for right now, it's actually going to be pretty straightforward. So when you guys are putting this together, just try to follow the directions as best as possible. I'm going to show you guys a couple of snippets and shortcuts, but it's going to be much easier than it has been in the past. So what you guys are going to see whenever you open your power supply bags is a whole bunch of different screws, but they're all kind of sectioned off, so you can't really mess it up. See this one, how this one says Intel LGA 2011? We're not going to be using that one. So go bye-bye. These are tinier screws for something else later on, but I'm not going to toss them yet, but I know I might need them. These will be our top-offs. We're going to use those. These are the longer screws. These are the only ones that you're going to use to put the fans in because they're the only ones long enough to get the fans on. Now, it's important to note, when we put the fans on, I will detail a lot of that stuff, but we need to get the orientation of that correct. And then these are going to be what actually mount to our motherboard itself. So I'll show you guys that too. But as far as the parts and pieces of it, it looks like there's a whole bunch there, but really they have it all sectioned off to where it makes really good sense. Also, they come with two sets of kind of this semicircular mount to go onto the heatsink itself. We're only going to use these for Intel. These are for AMD specific. So once again, bye-bye. And when we're going to put our fans on, it's actually going to be pretty easy once you guys see how this goes. But if you look at your connectors, note there's two different connectors on each fan. This one is always RGB style, and this one, right, is always fan style. So that way you can't plug them into the wrong things. This is solely to get you nice pretty colors. This is what actually operates the fan itself. And I'll show you guys that connections. But what I did want to show you was this little section right here. I don't know if you guys can see it that well. Hang on. Aha! I get some light in there. That's better. You guys see the arrows there? Right? There's an arrow that says this direction, and then there's an arrow that says this direction. That's going to show you which way the airflow is going. We want the airflow to basically, this arrow is just showing the way the direction the fan spins. That doesn't matter as much. The one we really want to pay attention to is this guy where it shows us airflow through it. It shows direction through this way, which is the way most fans are, right? On the back of it, you see how it's got a label and stuff like that? That's usually the back of the fan or the exhaust for the fan. So this pretty little section, this is going to light up all nice and cool whenever we have it plugged in, is the front or the intake. So we're going to want to see the intake on our radiator, because the way we're going to mount it, we're going to push air from the inside of the case across the radiator and then up and out to the outside air. That should give us the best airflow and the best temps. So when you guys are putting these fans on, orientation of where the wires are isn't really going to make a whole bunch of difference. But I do encourage everyone, when you put your fans on, again, don't tighten any of your screws all the way down yet. Make sure they're loose, just kind of thread it in. So see, my fan can't go anywhere, but I've got it in. I will try to tighten them before I put it into the case, but a lot of times you end up having to make adjustments and things like that. So it's a smart idea just to not wire anything in or tighten anything down, because, well, there's a good chance it may have to shimmy or move when we're getting it into the case. But as far as the screws go, it's pretty self-explanatory. Thread them in. So one of the first things we want to do to get ready to get this thing in the case is to take off this little metal pad. It's going to slide around a lot. It's really just some magnets to attach the filter to the top so you don't get a whole bunch of dust in it. But you can set that to the side for now. What we're going to try to do is we're going to take the screws, these screws, right, that are a little bit bigger, and when we mount the radiator up inside, we're actually going to screw the radiator down from the outside when we go into the case. The first thing I really want to do, though, is I'm going to get on my back plane for the CPU cooler itself, and it's really pretty easy. It's got a couple strips of adhesive. If you look at the orientation, they show you in the manual which way it's actually supposed to go on there. If I can find it. Hold on. So when you put your back plane on, take off these little strips here, because it's going to actually give a little bit of sticky adhesive so it can stay where we put it. You're going to want to try to align it with the shape of this metal pad that's underneath, but you'll kind of see which way is correct, because you can see how it has the openings for the screws, and it lets this guy mesh fully onto the board. That's basically going to provide our mounting bracket, so when we screw in from the other side, it gives us something to screw into. So now I'm probably going to try to mount the radiator and the fan assembly on the inside, because it's more or less ready. I've got my screws ready for the mount. I'm going to go ahead and try to get this thing mounted on the inside. Now the orientation, I want you guys to pay careful attention to. I'm going to keep my tube side, right, where my tubes actually go in, towards the front, and I'm going to mount the radiator straight up into the top receptacle. If you look, you can actually match up the screws, right? You can kind of see my screw holes there. You can match up your screw holes, but it will move in that spot a little bit. But basically just match up your screw holes there and screw it down to where it's just held in place. And that'll be good for now. So you guys couldn't really see it because I was trying to screw it in, but basically I did my two outer corner screws, and I can still move it. But I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of the screws in so they're all there, but we'll tighten them down way later. I want to be able to move this back and forth for now until I can get it in the right place later on. Alright, now you guys can kind of see, I've got a lot of wires and stuff kind of hanging out, and I'll deal with those here in a little bit. But one of the reasons I left this radiator loose is so I can work with those wires and kind of route them as I need to later on. Again, this is why you just don't tighten anything down yet. There's no need to, so let's make sure we get everything else in place first. But now we're actually ready to go ahead and mount our radiator, or mount our heatsink and pump from our AIO to our bracket assembly. It's really going to be pretty easy. We just have to make sure we get our thermal paste right, and this is usually what scares people the most. So I'm going to test fit just to make sure everything should go on correctly, and I just realized I didn't put on my mounts. That's these little half circle doohickeys, right? They are going to basically attach to the screw holes so that whenever we want to attach it to the board, they can go right there. So these little tiny screws, the smallest pitch thread screws, those are what's actually going to attach right here to our heat sink, right? They're going to thread through one side or the other and attach to this. I'm going to reference my manual just to make sure I'm not screwing it up, because it very easily can happen. And I'm paying attention to what they call the LGA 11115X. But basically they show, with this orientation, we should attach our plates over the top like so. And it can be different if you have an AMD or anything like that, but there's a little notch there for you to kind of align stuff with. So we'll put our screws through the bottom and screw into this pad on the top. So I'm going to do that real quick and show you guys. Okay, so you guys can also see now, right? Nope, that's good for it. I have my brackets mounted, right, to the extra ends. So now we can take these guys and screw them in to the back plane. Now they're actually pretty easy, right? It's just threading in one side or another. It doesn't matter. They're both the same screw depth. So it doesn't matter which side you use. You're really just going to tighten it down with your hands on all the screws for the back plane. Now these ones over in the corner can kind of get to be a pain in the butt, just because of all the capacitors and everything in the way, but as long as you're careful, it really is pretty fine. And I'm going to be fancy and make my mount the way I want to. Really, as far as how you orient it before you put it on, it doesn't really matter which way. It's all about, this technically is the way the CoolerMaster label goes, so if you wanted to look symmetrical, that's the way it probably should go, but I don't like the way my cables look when it does that. So I'm probably going to end up putting it on this way. Either way, it's not going to matter very much. As long as it's making good contact, that's all that matters. And the test fit shows it seems like it's going to fit pretty well. So now is one of the most important things. Thermal compound. This is the stuff that comes with the CoolerMaster kit, but you don't have to use it. And when you're applying thermal paste, I've always said a good size pea is about enough. That's a pretty good amount for what we need, because you have to think, when it flattens out, you want it to kind of smush and go everywhere. So I do a dollop about the size of a pea in the middle of the CPU. I'm not sure if this is conductive thermal compound or not. I'm going to assume no. But the real thing is, you don't want to get too much and you want to have enough. So I'm going to actually do a bit of a test. I'm going to remove my label, right? And as soon as I remove my label, I'm going to try to put my pad down. And I'm going to smush it and kind of scoot it around a little bit, just to make sure I'm getting good contact. Now when I try to pull it up, it actually doesn't even want to pull up that much because of the suction from underneath. Now when I look at it, I see that's actually a good amount of thermal paste. It's about perfect. There's enough there, but not too much to squeeze over and go other places. So I'm going to put it back down very carefully. And then we're going to use our top screws, which are right here. All right, that looks like this. All right, they're just little thumb screws once again. And all you have to do is screw them down to finger tight. Nothing fancy. You don't even need to use a screwdriver, really. It doesn't have to be super tight. You just need to make sure it's making fairly good contact. Now it's going to try to be a little bit off. These lines are going to try to throw your pressure off on different angles, but once you get this screwed down, we'll start making the connections. So now that we've got everything kind of screwed down. It doesn't want to move anywhere. That's a good sign. That means it's in place. My radiator's still moving, but I can always screw those on later. So now we have to make sense of all the wires that come from this. So I'm going to make my life a little bit easier to start. Every connector that looks like this with the shiny pins on the inside is RGB. So since that's not needed to make it work, I'm going to toss those for now. And I'm left with 3 wires. All 3 of these are for fan or the pump. So since we have so many fan connections, right, we need to make sense of what's what. Really, in essence, we need to make sure the fans are going to run at the same speeds more than anything. So the people at CoolerMaster were actually really nice and thought about it, and they gave us this handy dandy little adapter here. So this adapter is basically going to take 2 of their fans, right, the 2 from our radiator, and it's going to allow us to plug into those and do a 2-for-1. Right, so now we're only taking up 1 slot on our motherboard. We're going to have to find another one of those system fan plugins, and I think what I'm going to end up doing is probably using either the one up in the corner, because I don't know that I like using this one. That's going to put my wires right in the way. It might end up better later, but in the end it's not going to matter at this time being. We just want to make sure the fans are plugged in. The motherboard's going to run them at a certain speed based on what it thinks it needs to, but as long as they're plugged in and running, that's all that really matters. The other really important plug is this little 3-pin plug that comes off of the water pump itself. This is like a fan, and it needs to get power as well because that's the pump that circulates the water through the radiator system. So there is a fan connector underneath the radiator. It's not going to be hard to access. I probably should have tried to plug this in before I mounted the radiator, and again, this is why I didn't screw it down. I'm going to try to get it here the way I can, but there's a good chance I'm going to have to take the radiator out just to mount this where I want it to. So it's one of those things. It happens. Hang on. Guess what? Couldn't do it. My radiator's in the way. I'm gonna have to take all those screws back out. I probably should have only put 2 screws in to begin with, knowing that I would have run into this, but I also found that my RGB is going to be back behind my fans as well and the radiator. So yeah, I'm gonna have to take this out. I'm gonna recommend when you guys build yours, don't put the radiator in first, or at least put 2 screws in it so you can remove it easier and plug and play stuff later. So you guys aren't going to be able to see it that great because I can't move it very well, but basically I took my radiator off and just sat it down here. It's not going to make much of a difference. These wires can get moved around a little bit, and I'm going to take my CPU connector and I'm going to connect into where it says CPU fan, because that's what's going to run my pump. It's usually the place you want to land your pump. Also, while I'm in here, I'm going to go ahead and land 2 RGBs now that I know this is going to be in the way. You know what? I just found another one. We're only going to do 1. So right next to your CPU fan connector, there is a connector that says LED C2, and it has a connector that will accept that plug. And if you look at the plug really closely, you can see a little arrow on it. On the motherboard, there's a line that says 12 volts. Align your arrow with the 12 volt section and plug it in. That's all you got to do. I'm not going to do anything else right now, but I do want to get this plugged in before the radiator goes in. So I'm feeding my wire through the back, right above that connector. And then I'm going to gently align it and plug in my LED power. Now, I should be able to gently lay my PC down after I get my radiator mounted in. Everything looks like it's going to go fairly well. My wires aren't bound up that much. Everything looks like it's going to be aligned still okay. Yeah, so far so good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to screw one screw in here and one screw in on the opposite corner, and then I'm just going to leave those. Now I can set my PC down, make sure my connections are still there, right, and my wires are a little bit out of the way, and now I should be in better shape. It's a little gross, but I'll clean up my cable management later. I'm not too worried about it at the moment. So I'm going to take all my RGB stuff and I'm going to feed it through one of the slots to hook it up in the back, because that's where we're going to end up making all these connections. But as far as the power supply goes, as far as the radiator goes, all I need to do is really tighten these screws down and it is all wired up, ready to go.